Hey guys, it's Lauren. So I do a lot of book videos, and somebody asked me in a comment in one of the more recent ones, what books, what more recent titles I would recommend. And it occurred to me that I really haven't talked a lot about new releases. I do a lot about classics, and I've got a video about advanced books. I've done a number of book videos, but I haven't done anything that really highlights, I think, some of the things that have come out really recently, like in the last, let's say, 2 years or so. And some of the folks who are writing today, especially people who maybe you haven't heard of. So I picked 5 books that I think are really important. And for different reasons. And I'm going to talk really briefly about all of these. I'm going to try to keep this video short. This isn't a review video necessarily. I just kind of want to throw these titles out there as recommendations for people who might be completely new to witchcraft, any kind of witchcraft, or who maybe have been around a while and are looking for a different angle, or, I hesitate to call any of these books beginner books. Some of them are decidedly not beginner books, but I do think that all of them are beginner friendly. Let me put it that way, if that makes sense. Okay. And I like all of them for different reasons. And spoiler, I included my book here too, just because I wrote it for a really specific reason. And I know that some of you who followed me on YouTube maybe aren't aware that I even wrote a book. So I've tossed that in here. I debated whether or not to do that, but I did it, so we'll see. So just to kick things off, this book just came out. This is by Matt Oren. This is Psychic Witch. And so Matt's been around for a really long time. He and I encountered each other on Tumblr 600 years ago. But this is his first book, and this one has been really highly anticipated because he's a very popular blogger. He's got a reputation online on pretty much all platforms for being just really a cheerleader for all kinds of practitioners and fellow authors and writers, and he's just an all-around positive, awesome person. So people were really pumped for this one, including myself. And the reason it's on this list, aside from just loving Matt Oren, is because it really gets to the root, I think, of how psychic ability is critical in witchcraft as a whole. I think that sometimes we get so caught up in talking about what kind of witches we're going to be, or are we going to be part of traditions or covens or solitary, or we get caught up in, I think, some of the more extraneous isn't the word, but I think some of the flashier parts of being a witch, and we overlook a lot of the inner stuff. And what I love about Psychic Witch is this emphasis that this is really the heart of witchcraft practice, is the development of these kinds of inner abilities. And it's applicable regardless of what kind of witchcraft you're interested in. There's a lot of really great exercises in here. Matt is super approachable and friendly. So great for beginners, but also great for folks who maybe have just neglected that part of their practice. I'm one of those witches. I'm not naturally psychic. It's taken me a lot of work to get to where I am in terms of those things. And he does a great job of putting this forth as a foundational practice that's really approachable for anybody. So this one's great. Second book, Jason Mankey's Transformative Witchcraft. This book does not get the attention that it deserves. So the reason this book is here, again, this one I would call beginner friendly, but it's definitely not a beginner's book. The reason it's on this list is because Jason, who is also a noted blogger, been around for a long time, he's very active on the festival circuit. This is really one of the first books that tackles some of the more significant concepts in particularly Wicca, but witchcraft as a whole. So to give you an idea, his chapters here, there's a lot of stuff about history. Like Jason is a very serious kind of amateur historian who's very invested and very well-read and well-researched. He's one of the most accessible people, I think, writing right now about the history of witchcraft, just by itself. So the first section here, he's looking at the origins of witchcraft. Part 2, he's talking about the cone of power and raising energy, which that's one of those things that gets tossed around in books, like, and then raise power, but nobody ever tells you what the fuck that means. This book tells you what the fuck that means. So, like, maybe it shouldn't be groundbreaking, but it really is. He's got a really excellent section here about dedications, initiations, and elevations, and kind of like how those work and why people do those. And it's not just for like traditional Wiccans, whatever, just the concept of degree systems and dedications and why do them. There's some really beautiful rituals in here. Jason, I think, is very well known, and rightly so, for his abilities to write ritual. Drawing down the moon, again, this is one of those things that gets tossed around, like that phrase, particularly in Wiccan spaces, and people don't necessarily talk about what that means. And then finally, the Great Rite, which again, people don't really write about in detail. So just looking at these concepts that are sort of everywhere, that very few people have actually addressed in an in-depth way for a popular audience. I mean, you can go digging for material like that online, but Jason really puts it out there in a way that's accessible to anyone. So this book is really great, especially for those of you who've been around for a while, especially for those of you who are Wiccan of any sort. This is one that's worth picking up. My next book is What is Remembered Lives by Phoenix LaFaye. I think this is her first Llewellyn title. But she's been an author for quite a long time. And the reason this book is on this list, and I'm happy to see that there are a number of books about this specifically, but this one I just think is so concise and it's all in one place, and this is such a great place to start. This is specifically about the concept of devotion and relationships with gods, with ancestors, and then with the Fae. And I think, again, kind of like with Matt's book, we talk a lot about some of the more kind of like the extraneous kind of outwardly cool things about witchcraft, but we don't really get to the meat of it sometimes. And he's talking about psychic power. Phoenix is talking about devotion. We do a lot of, I think we pay a lot of lip service to the idea of gods and spirits, but most people don't really have a handle on what that means, and I think that's because so many of us are coming from monotheistic traditions, particularly Christian traditions. A lot of us came from atheist or secular backgrounds like myself. So when you talk about like, well, I'm working with, this particular deity, nobody really tells you what exactly that means. Like, how do you go about doing that, and why would you do that? And I love that we now have an entire book, and it's not just about gods. It's more about the concept broadly. So there's a lot in here about honoring spirits, honoring the ancestors, working with your ancestors, making contact with the fairy realm. So if you're interested in those kind of spiritual others, if you're some kind of theist or you're interested in spirit work, this is a really wonderful place to start. My next book, I'm going to go ahead and toss mine for last. My next book, this one is written by somebody who's an elder in our community. So I love the perspective here because it's a new book, but it's written by somebody who's been around for like 50 years, guys. And that's What We Knew in the Night by Raven Grimassi. Raven died in 2019, and I know that hit the community pretty hard. I had met him several times, and he was somebody who I admired a great deal. I've written about him on Pathos a couple of times. So I've been a fan, okay? But the reason this book is on the list is because Raven always had this particular perspective that I really sort of like fought against when I was much younger. When I was in college and then I was getting into anthropology and history and religious studies, I was really interested in this idea of like, where does witchcraft come from? Like how can we trace its development in this kind of linear way that's backed up by evidence? And Raven's view would frustrate me because he was very invested in what he would call spiritual history. This idea that something didn't necessarily have to be literally true in order for it to have, like, capital T truth. And as I've gotten older, that idea has become important to me. And the reason this book is on the list, I think this is a wonderful book for beginners, but also for people who, again, are looking for a different perspective. But it's here because there is a romanticism about Raven's writing that I think is really critical right now, when so many of us, myself included, have become invested in nailing down a true origin or like a realness to witchcraft. Raven has always been, in his writing, kind of seeking out this spiritual thread. And he's always really dedicated to this idea of the old ways. So I just think that this lends a spirit to the art that sometimes gets overlooked in the age we live in, where people are just really critical. And I'm not saying don't be critical, but I think that the perspective presented in this book lends a sort of beauty that some of our more clinical treatments are lacking. And reading it again, especially after his passing, was a really joyful experience. So this is another one that's really worth your time. Finally, my book. And I'll tell you why it's on here. It's not just because I necessarily want to self-promote myself. This is Traditional Wicca by Thorn Mooney, by me. And the reason I put it on this list is because this is the reason I wrote it, was there wasn't anything about being in a traditional coven. There wasn't anything about initiatory Wicca that had been written recently. A lot of the books, I wrote it because I found, as a young coven leader, when I would recommend books to people about initiatory Wicca, so Gardnerian, Alexandrian, Blue Star, Georgian, Central Valley, I could keep going, I found that I was recommending books that were decades old. Not that they weren't wonderful, and not that people shouldn't still read those books. They should. Those are all still on the recommended reading list. But I wanted something that was short, that was accessible, that somebody could just pick up if they were curious, and something that would really kind of speak to how people think about things today. So I wanted to address issues around hierarchy and gender and just some of the stuff that's maybe messy that didn't get discussed very, very thoroughly in the 70s and 80s because they weren't at the fore of people's minds. So anyway, this book, again, I would say it's beginner friendly, but I assume you know what Wicca is, so there's nothing in here about what traditional Wiccans actually, there's no rituals and spells. I don't give you histories of these traditions at length. It's really more of a practical book for people who are interested in becoming those kinds of Wiccans. I include some perspectives from some other contemporary practitioners from different traditions. But again, just trying to make that accessible to a new generation. So there you have it. There's my 5. I got Matt Oren here, Raven Grimassi, Jason Mankey, Phoenix LaFay, this person right here. So there you have it. Those are some of my favorites from the last couple of years. So happy reading as always, and I'll see you guys next time.